Hi, this is Erica Merrill, and I'm the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And I am very excited to have on our show today attorney Brian Jones. He owns a criminal defense firm out of Ohio. Very excited to have attorney Brian Jones on the show today. We are going to be talking about DNA results and how those pertain to criminal cases. And so, welcome to the show today, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Erica, thank you for having me today. This is a good topic.
It's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, we hear everywhere about all of these DNA kits that you can send away your DNA and get results on your ancestors and find out lots of interesting information and even sometimes medical information on diseases and that sort of thing that can help you out. But the most famous DNA cases are the ones that we see maybe on TV, where they are always going to solve a crime by getting DNA, and sometimes they have to sneak around and get somebody's cup or can. There's just a lot of interesting things that happen with that. Can you tell us when someone in law enforcement can really ask for your DNA?
Absolutely, Erica. So there are a variety of ways that law enforcement can get a sample of DNA from an individual. First is they can issue a subpoena to one of these private companies like 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, any of these places that you were talking about that do these private DNA testing. Law enforcement can issue a subpoena to them, and they will turn over the results of your DNA test. So when you're submitting your DNA to these individuals, to these companies, you need to be very aware of the rights and the privacy rights that you're giving up in those circumstances. Now, for law enforcement to get a sample directly from you, then they need a warrant to obtain that. A lot of people will give that up voluntarily. But they can't use it for investigative purposes unless they have a warrant or your consent. Now, the other way in Ohio that law enforcement often obtains DNA is at the point of a felony arrest. Ohio law requires, in addition to a photograph and fingerprints, that law enforcement collect a DNA sample. Now, that DNA sample can only be used for identification purposes if you were to skip bail or otherwise avoid jurisdiction of the court. They can't use that for criminal testing and identification in the criminal case itself. They have to have a warrant for that. So those are, generally speaking, the three ways that law enforcement can collect DNA from an individual. Now, you mentioned also, Erica, collecting a used soda can or a cigarette butt. Really anything that you can leave DNA on. And there is a wide array of items that collect our DNA over the course of a day, can be a source of a sample. Not a forensically valid sample, but a sample nonetheless.
Wow, that is really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about, why would you use DNA to link somebody to a crime?
So DNA is a form of trace evidence. DNA can establish that a particular person was in a particular location. It can establish that a particular person had contact with a particular object at one time. And it can yield a variety of degrees of identification. So it can identify who an individual was that touched an object. Was that person male or female? It can narrow down the field from the 7 billion people on Earth down to, let's say, a few million, depending on the quality of the sample itself.
Wow, that is very interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier about, really warning us about giving our DNA away to a third-party company and how it could be used later on against us if we ever were implicated in a crime. Is there any way to prevent that from happening?
Well, it depends on the individual company's fine print. So what we're looking for in the contract that you sign when you agree to let that company sample your DNA and provide you your results is what level of law enforcement compliance do they provide? Even in states where privacy laws prevent this, law enforcement can lie to you in order to entice you and give them their permission to collect your DNA. So say they want DNA from you, Erica. They can deceive you into saying, well, we're just trying to exclude you from this investigation, or we need a comparative sample because we're looking at one of your relatives. Like what happened to Eleanor Holmes, who was an innocent woman and was lied to secure her DNA sample. Ultimately, her son was convicted of a decades-old murder. So they used the mother to get at the son. Oftentimes, a DNA sample is not a full picture of the individual's DNA. So the quality of the sample itself can really determine how accurate DNA testing is. If we think more in terms of something that people have a broader and longer term understanding of, like fingerprints, if you put your fingerprint directly onto a glass, very carefully, and you roll your finger across that piece of glass, you're going to leave most likely a very detailed and a very clear fingerprint on that piece of glass. In the same way, if you take a cotton swab and you swab it on the inside of your cheek, and you put that swab directly into a sealed container, you're going to have a very good DNA sample. Now let's talk about what evidence is actually typically collected in a crime scene. So we talked about cigarette butts. We talked about soda cans, underwear, clothing items, touch DNA on bedclothes and other locations around the house. Those samples are often degraded by time and intermingled with the DNA of other individuals. And so the results that come out of them can often be very mixed at best and wildly inaccurate at worst.
Wow, that sounds like you're really setting somebody up for failure as far as the DNA samples they're using. I mean, are those the ones that they can submit to the court when they're kind of degraded like that?
They are, Erica. Most DNA testing centers have a minimum standard of loci that they require to report a DNA result. And the loci are locations on an individual's DNA that we know from scientific testing and peer-reviewed research often have what are called short tandem repeats. That's when we talk about STR testing, short tandem repeats. And what we see in those locations of everybody's DNA is that there's a preset number of times that a particular sequence in the DNA repeats itself over and over again. Now, many of those loci are DNA left over from when we were a different species. They don't have any application to how the human body is built today, but the DNA is still there. Some locations actually do express, as the term is called, in the human body today, but we still have these repeats. And it doesn't create a genetic defect of any kind. It's just the way DNA is built. So each of these loci is tested. Now, some labs have a minimum standard of 6 loci that they test, and if they get a match in those 6 loci, then they will report a result. Some labs require 10, 11, 12, or even up to 26 loci to say that they have a testable and a reportable result from a DNA test. It really depends on the individual lab standards as far as what they feel comfortable reporting as an accurate DNA result. The other interesting thing about these short tandem repeats is that they occur both on the X chromosome, of which women have 2, and the Y chromosome, and men have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. Now, the interesting thing about Y chromosomes is that my Y chromosome is identical to my brothers, all of my male children, and all of my paternal lineage, and all the males that go up in my male ancestry. So if you think about going back 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, my DNA is shared with millions of other men around the world in almost an identical fashion. So if you're only testing 6 loci, the chances of my DNA matching up to some other males anywhere in the world can be very high, in fact. When we get results reported about why short tandem repeat testing, they're often reported in terms of this individual is 1 in 600. This individual can be 1 in 200. They're very, very low numbers that are often reported as a quote unquote match in these YSTR situations. So it really doesn't exclude people like people that have a similar genetic makeup. So people who are of European descent, people who are of African descent, people who are of Latin American descent. These individuals have even more similar genetic makeup, especially on the Y chromosome. And it makes it very difficult to distinguish one from another.
Wow, that is mind-blowing and interesting. I had no idea. I think most people, when they think of DNA, they think of something that is so unique that it is only for that one person. But what you're saying is that really you could be confused with lots of people that have a similar makeup of your own chromosomes.
That's exactly right, Erica. And what law enforcement and prosecutors often try to portray as a test that excludes everybody else in a household is very much not reporting that result. The reality is that white males, for the most part, share very similar Y chromosomes. Likewise with African American males, Hispanic males, et cetera, et cetera. In an area like Ohio, where there's a very heavily white population, you can have a Y chromosome that's very similar to the vast majority of males in the area. It really doesn't exclude anybody. The problem is that when we go to court, all of those other males in the area aren't tested as exclusionary subjects. So we don't know who really submitted a Y DNA unknown sample. We only know who submitted the known samples that were collected and tracked and are not those pure samples from the cheek swab.
Well, I can imagine that would get quite confusing then when, something like the sample was on somebody's clothing and that was in the laundry with a whole bunch of other people's dirty laundry and it got all mixed up. I mean, it sounds like that might make it a little more difficult to prove and to use those DNA samples in that case.
That's exactly right, Erica. We actually had a case a couple of years ago where there was a father, 2 sons, and an uncle living in the same household. And our client, the father, was accused of a sexual assault. And one of the reasons he was accused of that sexual assault was because DNA pulled from the accuser matched up to his Y chromosomal DNA. The issue with the way the prosecutor presented that evidence, and one of our huge advantages at trial, was that, in my opinion, inaccurate reporting of those results was that the brother has the same DNA. The sons have the same DNA. So any one of those other 3 individuals could have deposited that sample, or that sample could have been transferred from one article of clothing to another. There's no way to tell in DNA testing when a sample was put in a particular place or how a sample was put in a particular place. So whether that was through a skin cell falling on a particular item, or a touching of a particular item, or transfer from two inanimate objects.
Wow. I mean, to me, it sounds like those could be some of the reasons that you can get a DNA sample thrown out of a case. I mean, is that typically what happens, or are people just convicted on these DNA samples that could have been compromised?
Well, Erica, you have hit on one of the largest frustrations of being a criminal defense attorney, because even though these samples and these results are inaccurately reported by the prosecutor, that fact, that misconstruction of what these results mean, goes to the weight of the evidence that the jury has to decide, not the admissibility of the evidence. The reality is DNA testing, when done properly, is scientifically accepted, and it's widely regarded as accurate science. It's the reporting and use of those tests that prosecutors and police do, and they try to manipulate juries with, that is the real inaccuracy. So it's our job as defense attorneys first to educate jurors about what these DNA results actually say, and then show them, kind of pulling back the curtain and showing them how the prosecutor is trying to manipulate them into thinking it means something else.
Wow, this has all been incredibly interesting. I have you've answered all of my questions today, but I just wanted to make sure before we go that there isn't anything else that you'd like to share about this particular topic.
Well, there is one other item, Erica, and that is this. When you are considering giving your DNA to somebody else, be that a law enforcement officer or a private corporation that's going to perform genetic testing for you, you have to understand that you cannot claw that information back once it's given away. If it's a police officer that's asking for a DNA sample, demand a warrant. There are challenges that can be made to the decision to grant the warrant. There are very, very few challenges, and they are very difficult to win if you voluntarily give that DNA up. And likewise with services like Ancestry.com, 23andme.com, be really cognizant of how these private corporations are going to use your private information, because I guarantee you that they do not have your best interests at the top of their business plan. The top of their business plan is to make money. And one of the ways that you make money is by being in compliance and doing what law enforcement wants you to do. So there have been cases with these private entities turning over DNA information and innocent people being charged with crimes. There have been cases where, like we talked about with Eleanor Holmes, where individuals were manipulated into turning over DNA evidence and using that DNA evidence against family members. I don't think anybody wants to be in the position where, because they wanted to get an ethnic profile of their history, that they would be happy about the fact that one of their loved ones was charged with and possibly convicted of a heinous crime.
Wow, especially if they didn't do it. So that is definitely very, very topical, very interesting today. I do want to mention that while all of this is great to know, and you should be aware of these things, that unfortunately sometimes you will get charged with things and you will need help. And you should call the Office of Brian Jones. They are in court every single day handling these issues for over a decade, and their team is amazing. And they are here to help you. They're there to give you your options. And I know that it seems like a scary situation, but sometimes after talking with Brian and his team, you find that it's not as bad as it looks, and there are things that can be done to help you. And I think that knowledge is power, and the best thing to do is to pick up the phone and give them a call and find out about your case and find out what can be done.
Absolutely, Erica.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Brian. Really opening up our eyes to sending our DNA off to anyone, and later on suffering some dire consequences. And now we know. So thanks so much. We will look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. I'll look forward to seeing you next week, Erica. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.